Draperies made just for you at Ward's.
California Federal pays up to 7.5%.
How much, Mr. Cleveland?
California Federal pays 5.25% on passbook savings and up to 7.5% on new certificate accounts.
And free services?
16 free services, ladies and gentlemen, including traveler's checks, money orders, and notary service.
Mr. Cleveland.
Yes.
California Federal, here I come.
Good thinking.
Federal regulations require a substantial penalty for early withdrawals on certificate accounts.
It was not very long ago, Richard Nixon looked forward to those next 4 years. Secure in his mandate, undaunted by history.
My study of elections in this country, and of second terms particularly, is that second terms almost inevitably are downhill. And that is particularly true when there is what you call a landslide victory. As I have put it to some of my closest colleagues, generally when you think of a landslide, you're submerged by it. And you also think in terms of the landslide pushing you downhill. What I am trying to do is to change that historical pattern.
History has made no exception of Richard Nixon. For him, the downhill slope has been even steeper than it was for Lyndon Johnson or Harry Truman. It was just a year ago, January 1973, that he rode into office again on top of the landslide. A president by acclaim. 1 year later, he would be gasping for political life under the debris of Watergate. The man who called the story of his earlier career My Six Crises has told about this one as it was happening in his speeches, news conferences, and other public words. We have put this account together to see what it may tell about Richard Nixon's handling of this seventh crisis, which is not just his, but the nation's.
This is a CBS News special, reported by Dan Rather.
When Grandfather made this chair, he didn't get the legs quite even. That nick on the back there is Uncle Joe throwing his choo-choo at your mother. The cigarette burn on the arm is the night you were born. And now that you're going to move it across the country, wouldn't you like to know that the people who move it know how you feel about it? Allied Van Lines. We move families, not just furniture.
Introducing a new denture cleanser with extra effervescence for extra cleaning power. New extra effervescent Polydent tablets now with 50% more effervescent cleaning action than it ever had before. New Polydent with extra effervescence to help remove stains better. Extra effervescence to remove odor-causing particles better. Try new extra effervescent Polydent tablets for extra cleaning power.
The campaign of 72. For the first time since he came into the national limelight, Richard Nixon looked like a winner.
Well, President Nixon has swept back into the White House for the 4 more years for which all of his supporters chanted, and the supporters were in the heavy majority. The victory landslide, though it is, seems to be Mr. Nixon's alone, not his party's.
The president's personal victory seemed big enough to balance, if not outweigh, the Democrats' control of the Congress. 49 states wound up in the Nixon column. Almost 61% of the vote, the largest share ever racked up by a Republican presidential candidate. On Inauguration Day, the Nixon stock was still going up. 68% now approved of his leadership, according to an opinion poll. His inaugural speech had a commanding ring of old-time moral authority.
The time has passed when America will make every other nation's conflict our own, or make every other nation's future our responsibility, or presume to tell the people of other nations how to manage their own affairs. Let us remember that America was built not by government but by people, not by welfare but by work, not by shirking responsibility, but by seeking responsibility. In our own lives, let each of us ask, not just what will government do for me, but what can I do for myself?
Events seemed to move at Nixon's pace. The fighting in Vietnam was ended. The troops brought home on his timetable. The prisoners of war came home as Nixon protégés. Richard Nixon was calling the shots and taking a few at his old nemesis, the press.
We've done the very best that we can against very great obstacles, and we finally have achieved a peace with honor. I know it gags some of you to write that phrase, but that is true. And most Americans realize it is true, because it would be peace with dishonor had we, what some have used the vernacular, bugged out and allowed what the North Vietnamese wanted, the imposition of a communist government or of a coalition communist government on the South Vietnamese. That goal they failed to achieve. And consequently, we can speak with peace with honor and with some pride that it has been achieved. Now, as far as amnesty is concerned, I stated my views, and those views remain exactly the same. Certainly, I have sympathy for any individual who's made a mistake. We've all made mistakes, but also it's a rule of life. We all have to pay for our mistakes. Now, amnesty means forgiveness. We cannot provide forgiveness for them. Those who served paid their price. Those who deserted must pay their price. And the price is not a junket in the Peace Corps or something like that, as some have suggested. The price is a criminal penalty for disobeying the laws of the United States.
He was almost as stern with the Congress, whipping them with vetoes, refusing to spend the funds they voted on social measures instead of defense. $16 billion were impounded, 9 bills sent back to the Hill. Power seemed to lie at the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue, the president's end, until the fateful issue began to emerge. Watergate. The so-called Watergate case, so-called by the White House at first, picturing it as only the scene of some political shenanigans, for which the mischief makers had been quickly brought to trial. But a Senate committee was formed to investigate. The most serious question at the time was whether anybody on the White House staff could have been in on the escapade.
I will simply say, with regard to the Watergate case, what I have said previously, that the investigation conducted by Mr. Dean, the White House counsel, in which, incidentally, he had access to the FBI records on this particular matter, because I directed him to conduct this investigation, indicates that no one on the White House staff, at the time he conducted the investigation, that was last July and August, was involved or had knowledge of the Watergate matter. I have confidence in all of the White House people who have been named. I will express that confidence again, but I'm not going to comment on any individual matter that the committee may go into.
By the end of April, the first big question was answered. White House people had been involved in the illegal plan and an illegal cover-up. The president's 2 closest aides resigned. John Ehrlichman, H.R. Haldeman. Another, John Dean, was fired, and the president, announcing the casualty list, began to give ground.
Looking back at the history of this case, 2 questions arise. How could it have happened? Who is to blame? Political commentators have correctly observed that during my 27 years in politics, I've always previously insisted on running my own campaigns for office. But 1972 presented a very different situation in both domestic and foreign policy. 1972 was a year of crucially important decisions, of intense negotiations, of vital new directions, particularly in working toward the goal which has been my overriding concern throughout my political career, the goal of bringing peace to America, peace to the world. And that is why I decided, as the 1972 campaign approached, that the presidency should come first and politics second. To the maximum extent possible, therefore, I sought to delegate campaign operations, to remove the day-to-day campaign decisions from the president's office and from the White House. I also, as you recall, severely limited the number of my own campaign appearances. Who then is to blame for what happened in this case? In any organization, the man at the top must bear the responsibility. That responsibility, therefore, belongs here, in this office. I accept it. And I pledge to you tonight from this office that I will do everything in my power to ensure that the guilty are brought to justice and that such abuses are purged from our political processes in the years to come, long after I have left this office.
To rewrite Harry Truman, the buck did not stop here. While saying he accepted the responsibility, Mr. Nixon proceeded to spread it around.
I know that it can be very easy, under the intensive pressures of a campaign, for even well-intentioned people to fall into shady tactics, to rationalize this on the grounds that what is at stake is of such importance to the nation that the end justifies the means. And both of our great parties have been guilty of such tactics in the past. As we look at Watergate in a longer perspective, we can see that its abuses resulted from the assumption by those involved that their cause placed them beyond the reach of those rules that apply to other persons and that hold a free society together. That attitude can never be tolerated in our country. However, it did not suddenly develop in the year 1972. It became fashionable in the 1960s, as individuals and groups increasingly asserted the right to take the law into their own hands, insisting that their purposes represented a higher morality. Then, their attitude was praised in the press and even from some of our pulpits as evidence of a new idealism. The notion that the end justifies the means proved contagious. Thus, it is not surprising, even though it is deplorable, that some persons in 1972 adopted the morality that they themselves had rightly condemned and committed acts that have no place in our political system.
Let others wallow in Watergate, said Richard Nixon. His sights, he said, were on higher things, like the pursuit of peace and negotiations with the Soviet Union. In conducting the people's business, he would emphasize the upbeat. Even inflation had its bright side. It was, he said, a byproduct of prosperity. The same with energy, not yet a crisis, but a worry. The shortage exists, he said, because people are living better. The president himself was increasingly on the road, shuttling between houses. He was active, staying in the public eye, but keeping pretty much out of range of reporters. The Watergate issue pursued him. By mid-year, his rating in the polls was down below 50%. For this Republican fundraising event, tickets went unsold.
I have had, as you know, some political ups and downs during my 27 years in politics. And I have known times when I wondered if I had very many friends, and every man or woman who has been in politics knows that when you win, they're all your friends, and when you lose, it's pretty hard to find them, except when you lose and they're still there. They're the real friends. Let me say, I don't stand here tonight as a loser. We stand here tonight as winners, and we're going to win again. But I shall always remember this group tonight. Remember that when the going was tough, you hung in there. Remember that when the challenge was greatest, you didn't lose your faith. And if some of you think that, why does this kind of challenge have to come to us? Why do we have to endure it? Let me remind you that the finest steel has to go through the hottest fire. And I can assure you, my friends, this room is full of fine steel tonight. Thank you.
Hang a curtain? Simple, except on those occasions when arthritis flares up with minor pain and its stiffness. For help, take Anacin. Anacin contains the pain reliever most recommended by doctors for arthritis. When even simple movement can cause pain, Anacin relieves minor pain and so its stiffness for hours, brings more freedom of movement without pain. For hours of relief from minor arthritis pain and its stiffness, for more freedom of movement without pain, take Anacin.
This kitchen drain can explain a lot about sinus miseries. When closed, it blocks, but when open, it drains. When your sinuses are open, there's no congestion pain. But when sinuses close, you've got blockage, congestion, pressure, pain. You want Dristan tablets, strong medicines to open sinuses, help drain off congestion, reduce pressure, relieve pain in minutes. Dristan tablets helps drain off sinus pain fast.
Watergate, no longer just the scene of one crime. It became a byword for a whole category of offenses. From the time the Special Senate Committee's hearings started in mid-May, the list kept growing. Wiretaps and secret electronic buggings, illegal campaign funds, campaign sabotage, undercover warfare against so-called enemies in the press and throughout the country, the use of the income tax as a political weapon. For almost 6 months, the president adopted a strategy of silence, but public opinion polls indicated that the strategy was failing. He finally was forced to speak out in defense of his own name.
This investigation began as an effort to discover the facts about the break-in and bugging of the Democratic National Headquarters and other campaign abuses. But as the weeks have gone by, it has become clear that both the hearings themselves and some of the commentaries on them have become increasingly absorbed in an effort to implicate the president personally in the illegal activities that took place. In all of the millions of words of testimony, there is not the slightest suggestion that I had any knowledge of the planning for the Watergate break-in. As for the cover-up, my statement has been challenged by only one of the 35 witnesses who appeared. A witness who offered no evidence beyond his own impressions and whose testimony has been contradicted by every other witness in a position to know the facts. Many have urged that in order to help prove the truth of what I have said, I should turn over to the special prosecutor and the Senate committee recordings of conversation that I held in my office or on my telephone. However, a much more important principle is involved in this question than what the tapes might prove about Watergate. If I were to make public these tapes, containing as they do blunt and candid remarks on many different subjects, the confidentiality of the office of the president would always be suspect from now on.
The Watergate tapes, that damaging issue within an issue. A local federal court ordered the White House to turn over the tapes. Only the second time an American president has been served with a subpoena. Mr. Nixon refused to comply.
President, one of the lingering doubts about your denial of any involvement is concerning your failure to make the tapes available either to the Senate committee or the special prosecutor. You've made it perfectly clear you don't intend to release those tapes. Perfectly clear? Perfectly clear. But is there any way that you could have some group listen to tapes and give a report so that might satisfy the public mind?
I don't believe first it would satisfy the public mind, and it shouldn't. The second point is that as Mr. Wright, who argued the case, I understand very well before Judge Sirica this morning, has indicated, to have the tapes listened to, he indicated this also in his brief, either by a prosecutor or by a judge or in camera or in any way, would violate the principle of confidentiality. And I believe he is correct. That is why we are standing firm on the proposition that we will not agree to the Senate committee's desire to have, for example, its chief investigator listen to the tapes, or the special prosecutor's desire to hear the tapes, and also why we will oppose, as Mr. Wright did in his argument this morning, any compromise of the principle of confidentiality.
You have told us that your reasons are based on principle, separation of powers, executive privilege, things of this sort. Can you assure us that the tapes do not reflect unfavorably on your Watergate position, that there's nothing in the tapes that would reflect unfavorably?
There's nothing whatever. My concern is the one that I have expressed. Confidentiality, once destroyed, cannot, in my opinion, be restored.
By his aide's account, the president was feeling cornered. He decided to break out.
The special prosecutor felt that he needed the tapes for the purpose of his prosecution. That was why, working with the Attorney General, we worked out what we thought was an acceptable compromise, one in which Judge Stennis, now Senator Stennis, would hear the tapes and would provide a complete and full disclosure not only to Judge Sirica, but also to the Senate committee. Attorney General Richardson approved of this proposition. Senator Baker and Senator Ervin approved of the proposition. Mr. Cox was the only one that rejected it. When he rejected the proposal, I had no choice but to dismiss him.
Archibald Cox, the special prosecutor, was the loser in this showdown, but so was the president. Public reaction was overwhelmingly negative. He was forced to back down.
Today, White House counsel contacted Judge Sirica. We tried yesterday, but he was in Boston, as you know, and arrangements were made to meet with Judge Sirica on Tuesday to work out the delivery of the tapes to Judge Sirica.
That did not settle the tape issue. It kept unraveling. Unlike the prosecutor who was fired or his superiors who quit, unlike the tapes, some of which never were produced, the tape issue would not disappear. The public was outraged, its confidence shattered. The tape gap became Nixon's credibility gap.
Could you tell us your personal reaction and your political reaction, and within that word I mean your credibility with the American people, your reaction to the discovery that the Dean and Mitchell tapes did not exist?
Well, my personal reaction was one of very great disappointment, because I wanted the evidence out. And I knew that when there was any indication that something didn't exist, immediately there would be the impression that some way either the president, or more likely perhaps somebody on the president's staff, knew there was something on those tapes that wouldn't be wise to get out. And I would just simply say in conclusion, you can be very sure that this kind of a subject is one that is a difficult one to explain. It appears that it's impossible that when we have an Apollo system that we could have two missing tapes when the White House is concerned. But as far as those particular recordings are concerned, the reason that you've heard that there are difficulties in hearing them is that the system itself was not a sophisticated system. I don't mean to suggest by that the judge, by listening to them, will not be able to get the facts. And I would simply conclude by saying this. I think I know what is on these tapes from having listened to some, those before March 21st, and also from having seen from my secretary's notes the highlights of others. And I can assure you that those tapes, when they are presented to the judge, and I hope eventually to the grand jury, and I trust in some way we can find a way at least to get the substance to the American people, they will prove these things without question. One, that I had no knowledge whatever of the Watergate break-in before it occurred. Two, that I never authorized the offer of clemency to anybody, and as a matter of fact, turned it down whenever it was suggested. I realize that some will wonder about the truth of these particular statements that I made. I'm going to hand out later, I won't hand them out, but I'll have one of your executives hand out my May 22nd statement, my August 15th statement, and one with regard to these two tapes. You can believe them if you want. I can tell you it is the truth.
For theater and Showtime.
Some people, quite properly appalled at the abuses that occurred, will say that Watergate demonstrates the bankruptcy of the American political system. I believe precisely the opposite is true. Watergate represented a series of illegal acts and bad judgments by a number of individuals. It was the system that has brought the facts to light and that will bring those guilty to justice. A system that in this case has included a determined grand jury, honest prosecutors, a courageous judge, John Sirica, and a vigorous free press.
That was in the first flush of public acknowledgement of Watergate. But after a season of Watergate hearings and Watergate headlines, the president's brief tribute to the press became inoperative.
Sir, last week in your speech, you referred to those who would exploit Watergate to keep you from doing your job. Could you specifically detail who those are?
I would suggest that where the shoe fits, people should wear it. I would think that some political figures, some members of the press, perhaps, some members of the television, perhaps would exploit it. I don't impute, interestingly enough, motives, however, that are improper interest. Because here's what is involved. There are a great number of people in this country that would prefer that I do resign. There are a great number of people in this country that didn't accept the mandate of 1972. After all, I know that most of the members of the press corps were not enthusiastic, and I understand that, about either my election in 68 or 72. And so I say I impute no improper motives to them. I think they would prefer that I fail. On the other hand, I'm not going to fail. I'm here to do a job, and I'm going to do the best I can, and I'm sure the fair-minded members of this press corps, and that's most of you, will report when I do well, and I'm sure you will report when I do badly. It's rather difficult to have the President of the United States on prime time television, not prime time, although I would suppose the newscasters would say that the news programs are really the prime time. But for 4 months, to have the President of the United States, by innuendo, by leak, by, frankly, leers and sneers of commentators, which is their perfect right, attacked in every way without having some of that confidence being worn away. Now, how is it restored? Well, it's restored by the President not allowing his own confidence to be destroyed. That's to begin. The second, it's restored by doing something. We have tried to do things. The country hasn't paid a great deal of attention to it, and I may say the media hasn't paid a great deal of attention to it, because your attention, quite understandably, is in the more fascinating area of Watergate.
It was not just Watergate, said one editorial writer. It was all the acts of arrogance, like the wiretaps, the secret bombing of Cambodia, the break-in by White House plumbers looking for dirt on Daniel Ellsberg. In Mr. Nixon's line of defense on various issues, two main themes emerged: historical precedent and national security.
For many Americans, the term Watergate also has come to include a number of national security matters that have been brought into the investigation, such as those involved in my efforts to stop massive leaks of vital diplomatic and military secrets and to counter the wave of bombings and burnings and other violent assaults of just a few years ago. Every president since World War II has believed that in internal security matters, the president has the power to authorize wiretaps without first obtaining a search warrant. An act of Congress in 1968 had seemed to recognize such power. Last year, the Supreme Court held to the contrary, and my administration is, of course, now complying with that Supreme Court decision. But until the Supreme Court spoke, I had been acting, as did my predecessors, President Truman, President Eisenhower, President Kennedy, President Johnson, in a reasonable belief that in certain circumstances the Constitution permitted and sometimes even required such measures to protect the national security in the public interest.
Mr. President, what was authorized, even if the burglary in Dr. Feeling's office wasn't, what was authorized was a 1970 plan which, by your own description, permitted illegal acts, illegal breaking and entering, mail surveillance, and the like. Now, under the Constitution, you swore an oath to execute the laws of the United States faithfully. If you were serving in Congress, would you not be considering impeachment proceedings and discussing impeachment possibility against an elected public official who had violated his oath of office?
I would if I had violated the oath of office. I would also, however, refer you to the recent decision of a Supreme Court, or at least an opinion even last year, which indicates inherent power in the presidency to protect the national security in cases like this. I should also point to you that in the 3 Kennedy years and the 3 Johnson years through 1966, when burglarizing of this type did take place, when it was authorized on a very large scale, there was no talk of impeachment, and it was quite well known. I should also point out that when you ladies and gentlemen indicate your great interest in wiretaps, and I understand that the height of the wiretaps was when Robert Kennedy was Attorney General in 1963. I don't criticize it, however. He had over 250 in 1963, and of course the average in the Eisenhower administration and the Nixon administration is around 110. There were some very highly sensitive matters involved, not only in Ellsberg, but also another matter so sensitive that even Senator Ervin and Senator Baker have decided that they should not delve further into them. I don't mean by that we're going to throw the cloak of national security over something because we're guilty of something. I'm simply saying that where the national security would be disserved by having an investigation, the president has the responsibility to protect it, and I'm going to do so.
Among all the year's scandals and suspicions, there was one that hit the president where he lived. His real estate deals and personal finances were explained first one way, then another. Even his tax returns had to be disclosed to his fellow taxpayers.
There have been some conflicting reports about your real estate dealings in California, and I'd like to ask about that. Several different versions have been released by the White House, both as to your own personal financial involvement and as to the government's expenditures in San Clemente and at Key Biscayne. And your auditors, I understand from news reports, say that the entire audit has not been released on your financial dealings out there. I'd like to ask you if why we've had so many conflicting reports to start with, and second, one of the questions that's raised by the only partial release of the audit is, have you paid the taxes on the gain realized in the sale of the land to Rebozo and Alphenau in San Clemente?
Any other questions you want to go into? Of course,
whatever a president does is in the field of his property is public knowledge, and questions of that sort I do not resent at all. I do resent, I might say, the implications, however, first that whether at Key Biscayne or in San Clemente, my private property was enriched because of what the government did. As a matter of fact, what the government did at San Clemente reduced the value of the property. If you see 3 Secret Service gazebos, and if you see some of the other fences that block out the rather beautiful view of the hills and the mountains that I like, you would realize that what I say is quite true. Reduces its value as far as a residential property is concerned. I borrowed the money to acquire the property, and I still owe it. I own no stocks and no bonds. I think I am the first president in this office since Harry Truman. I don't own a stock or a bond. I sold everything before I came into office. All that I have are the 2 pieces of property in Florida which adjoin each other, the piece of property in San Clemente with which you were familiar, and a house in Whittier Boulevard in which my mother once lived. I have no other property, and I owe money on all of them. Third, as far as the capital gain matter, which is a technical matter that you have mentioned, I should point out, and maybe this is good news for people who wonder if presidents are exempt from what the IRS does. The IRS has had a full field review or audit of my income tax returns for 1971 and 1972, and included in its audit the transaction which you refer to, in which some argue there was a capital gain and some argue that there were not. It's a matter of a difference between accountants. The IRS, after its audit, did not order any change. If it had, I would have paid the tax. It did not order a change.
Questions have persisted about that Internal Revenue Service audit, so many that the matter has been turned over to a congressional committee. Another question: why, for 2 straight years, had the president paid less than $900 income tax on an annual income of about $250,000?
I paid $79,000 in income tax in 1969. In the next 2 years, I paid nominal amounts. It wasn't because of the deductions for, shall we say, a cattle ranch or interest, or, all these gimmicks that you got where you can deduct from, which most of you know about, I'm sure. If you don't, your publishers do, because... But the reason was this. Lyndon Johnson came in to see me shortly after I became president. He told me that he had given his presidential papers, or at least most of them, to the government. He told me that under the law, up until 1969, presidential or vice presidential papers given to the government were a deduction and should be taken and could be taken as a deduction from the tax. And he said, you, Mr. President, ought to do the same thing. I said, I don't have any presidential papers. He said, you got your vice presidential papers. And I thought of that a moment, and I said, all right, I'll turn them over to the tax people. And then, of course, overriding all of that are the story to the effect that I have $1 million in campaign funds, which was broadly printed throughout this country, with retractions not quite getting quite as much play as the printing of the first, and particularly not on television. The newspapers did much better than television in that respect, I should point out. And second, they said, how is it that as far as this money is concerned, how is it possible for you to have this kind of investment when all you earned was $800,000 as president? Well, I should point out, I wasn't a pauper when I became president. I wasn't very rich, as presidents go. I made a lot of money. I made $250,000 from a book and the serial rights, which many of you were good enough to purchase also. In the practice of law, and I'm not claiming I was worth it, but apparently former vice presidents or presidents are worth a great deal to law firms, and I did work pretty hard. But also in that period, I earned between $100,000 and $250,000 every year. So that when I, in 1968, decided to become a candidate for president, I decided to clean the decks and to put everything in real estate. I sold all my stock for $300,000. That's all I own. I sold my apartment in New York for $300,000. I'm using rough figures here. And I had $100,000 coming to me from the law firm. And so that's where the money came from. Let me just say this. And I want to say this to the television audience. I made my mistakes. But in all of my years of public life, I have never profited from public service. I've earned every cent. And in all of my years of public life, I have never obstructed justice. And I think, too, that I can say that in my years of public life, that I welcome this kind of examination, because people have got to know whether or not their president is a crook. Well, I'm not a crook. I've earned everything I've got.
The president's tax returns showed he had taken heavy deductions for interest. And to some people, the write-off on a donation of official papers was another gimmick. The vice president's financial scandals, charges of kickbacks and tax evasion were Mr. Agnew's personal affair. But his resignation in disgrace hardly helped Mr. Nixon's image.
I proudly present to you the man whose name I will submit to the Congress of the United States for confirmation as the Vice President of the United States, Congressman Gerald Ford.
Was this only Agnew's replacement, or was it Nixon's heir apparent? Resignation and impeachment were now being discussed seriously. The downhill curve of the polls had hit bottom, 27%. The lowest rating for any president since Harry Truman's failure to get a truce in Korea. Richard Nixon, the landslide victor, was now a minority president.
I've worked in the woods 20 years, and I think highly of this saw. It tackles quite large limbs and does it with ease. Light, easy to handle.
The Echo Saw.
See these dealers for the best deal. Echo Chainsaws.
This fine quality worsted suit is fully lined, hand-tailored, and especially styled for California living. At other men's stores, it would sell for $135 and more. But at my new Cesar Romero stores, it costs $88.
And now, during our first ever January clearance, hundreds of suits from our regular stock are on sale at even lower prices.
Visit any Cesar Romero store, and don't be surprised if you see me there. After all, I'm a partner in the business.
Once the Watergate case broke open, the president's health became a subject not so much of sympathy as suspicion, starting in July, when he came out of the hospital after a bout of pneumonia.
I was rather amused by some very well-intentioned people who thought that perhaps the burdens of the office and, some of the rather rough assaults that any man in this office gets from time to time brings on an illness. And that after going through such an illness that I might get so tired that I would consider either slowing down or even some suggested resigning. Well, now, just so we set that to rest, I want to use a phrase that my Ohio father used to use. Any suggestion that this president's ever going to slow down while he's president, or is ever going to leave this office until he continues to do the job and finishes the job he was elected to do, anyone who suggests that's just plain poppycock. We're going to stay on this job till we get the job done. To be under a constant barrage, 12 to 15 minutes a night on each of the three major networks for 4 months, tends to raise some questions in the people's mind with regard to the president, and it may raise some questions with regard to the capacity to govern. But I also know this. I was elected to do a job. Watergate is an episode that I deeply deplore, and had I been running the campaign rather than trying to run the country, and particularly the foreign policy of this country this time, it would never have happened. But that's water under the bridge. It's gone now.
In New Orleans in August, the strains of the job seemed to be showing when the president publicly humiliated his new secretary, Ronald Ziegler. The president's fitness to govern, physically, emotionally, and his capacity to govern, the two issues merged and then erupted in one explosive week in October. the week during the Middle East War when the United States and the Soviet Union bristled at each other from the sidelines. It was just 5 days after the Saturday night massacre in Washington. The impact of Watergate on the American presidency was clearly an international issue.
President, I'd like to ask you a question about the Mideast. To what extent do you think your Watergate troubles influenced Soviet thinking about your ability to respond in the Mideast? And did your Watergate problems convince you that the U.S. needed a strong response in the Mideast to convince other nations that you have not been weakened?
Well, I've noted speculation to the effect that the Watergate problems may have led the Soviet Union to miscalculate. I tend to disagree with that, however. I think Mr. Brezhnev probably can't quite understand how the President of the United States wouldn't be able to handle the Watergate problems. He'd be able to handle it all right if he had them. But I think what happens is that what Mr. Brezhnev does understand is the power of the United States. What he does know is the President of the United States. What he also knows is that the President of the United States, when he was under unmerciful assault at the time of Cambodia, at the time of May 8th, when I ordered the bombing and the mining of North Vietnam, at the time of December 18th, still went ahead and did what he thought was right. The fact that Mr. Brezhnev knew that regardless of the pressures at home, regardless of what people see and hear on television night after night, he would do what was right. That's what made Mr. Brezhnev act as he did. I have a quality which I guess I must have inherited it from my Midwestern mother and father, which is that the tougher it gets, the cooler I get. Of course, it isn't pleasant to get criticism. Some of it's justified, of course. It isn't pleasant to find your honesty questioned. It isn't pleasant to find, for example, that, speaking of my friend Mr. Rebozo, that despite the fact that those who printed it and those who said it knew it was untrue, said that he had a $1 million trust fund for me that he was handling, it was nevertheless put on one of the networks, knowing it was untrue. It isn't pleasant, for example, to hear or read that $1 million in campaign funds went into my San Clemente property, and even after we have a complete audit, to have it repeated. Those are things which, of course, do tend to get under the skin of the man who holds this office. But as far as I'm concerned, I have learned to expect it. It has been my lot throughout my political life, and I suppose because I've been through so much, that may be one of the reasons that when I have to face an international crisis, I have what it takes.
In this climactic news conference, the president seemed to be venting the whole year's frustrations, venting them on his antagonists on the scene, the press.
I have never heard or seen such outrageous, vicious, distorted reporting in 27 years of public life. I'm not blaming anybody for that. Perhaps what happened is that what we did brought it about, and therefore the media decided that they would have to take that particular line. But when people are pounded night after night with that kind of frantic, hysterical reporting, it naturally shakes their confidence. And yet, I should point out that even in this week, when many thought that the president was shell-shocked, unable to act, the president acted decisively in the interests of peace and the interests of the country. And I can assure you that whatever shocks gentlemen of the press may have, or others, and political people, these shocks will not affect me in my doing my job.
President, I wonder if you could share with us your thoughts. Tell us what goes through your mind when you hear people who love this country and people who believe in you say reluctantly that perhaps you should resign or be impeached.
Well, I'm glad we don't take the vote in this room, we say. And I understand the feelings of people with regard to impeachment and resignation. As a matter of fact, Mr. Rather, you may remember that when I made the rather difficult decision, I thought the most difficult decision of my first term on December 18th, the bombing by B-52s of North Vietnam, that exactly the same words were used on the networks. I don't mean by you, but they were quoted on the networks that were used now. Tyrant, dictator, he's lost his senses, he should resign, he should be impeached. But I stuck it out, and as a result of that, we not only got our prisoners of war home, as I've often said, on their feet rather than on their knees, but we brought peace to Vietnam, something we haven't had and didn't for over 12 years.
Not being a member of the Washington Press Corps, I'm not going to ask you when you're going to retire, but I'm going to ask you, when you do leave the White House, what do you plan to do?
I think it depends on when I leave. What I probably will do some writing and perhaps contribute to bettering the political process. Let me say this. Neither party is without fault in the campaign of 1972. Quite a bit of violence on the other side. I never spoke any place without getting a pretty good working over. Neither party was without fault with regard to the financing. They raised $36 million, and some of that, like some of ours, came from corporate sources and was illegal because the law had been changed, and apparently people didn't know it. And as far as congressmen or senators are concerned, they'll all tell you that with the new laws and so forth, there ought to be some changes. I think that if we can't get the Congress to act on the proposal I gave to them 6 months ago to provide a commission to set up new rules for campaign contributions, limiting them, new rules for campaign procedures, then after I leave office, I'm going to work for that. Because I don't want to be remembered as the man who maybe brought peace for the first time in 12 years, who opened to China, who opened to Russia, maybe avoided a war in the Mideast, maybe, if we can continue it, got unemployment down for the first time in 18 years. For the first time in peacetime, it's down at 4.5%. It was never at that low level, never below 5% in the 60s, any time in the 60s, neither the Kennedy nor the Johnson administration, except during the war years. I want to be remembered, I would trust, as a president that did his best to bring peace and also did his best to bring a degree of prosperity, perhaps a contribution in the energy field, in the environmental field, but also one who did his best when his own campaign got out of hand to do everything possible to see that other campaigns didn't get out of hand in the future. Now,
As the first downhill year of the term drew toward a close, Richard Nixon's presidency was itself the great public issue. It was closing on a slight upgrade. His rating in the polls improved several points, but still less than half what it was a year before. In his relations with Congress, it was they who now had the upper hand. He'd been forced to spend their funds, his war powers had been restricted, his vetoes overridden. The president was on the defensive, and there were questions still unanswered, disclosures still to be made, as he took his stand on the record, or part of the record.
It was just 1 year ago that I was reelected as President of the United States of America. During this past year, we have made great progress in achieving the goals that I set forth in my reelection campaign. We have ended the longest war in America's history. All of our prisoners of war have been returned home. And for the first time in 25 years, no young Americans are being drafted into the armed services. We have made progress toward our goal of a real prosperity, a prosperity without war. The rate of unemployment is down to 4.5%, which is the lowest unemployment in peacetime that we've had in 16 years. And we are finally beginning to make progress in our fight against the rise in the cost of living. These are substantial achievements in this year, 1973. But I would be less than candid if I were not to admit that this has not been an easy year in some other respects, as all of you are quite aware. As a result of the deplorable Watergate matter, great numbers of Americans have had doubts raised as to the integrity of the President of the United States. I've even noted that some publications have called on me to resign the office of President of the United States. Tonight, I would like to give my answer to those who have suggested that I resign. I have no intention whatever of walking away from the job I was elected to do. As long as I am physically able, I'm going to continue to work 16 to 18 hours a day for the cause of a real peace abroad and for the cause of prosperity without inflation and without war at home. And in the months ahead, I shall do everything that I can to see that any doubts as to the integrity of the man who occupies the highest office in this land, to remove those doubts where they exist. And I am confident that in those months ahead, the American people will come to realize that I have not violated the trust that they placed in me when they elected me as President of the United States in the past. And I pledge to you tonight that I shall always do everything that I can to be worthy of that trust in the future. Thank you and good night.
Hello, I'm Marcy Davis with an important message from the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. Starting in January, supplemental security income payments will be made to people with little or no income who are 65 or over, or blind, or disabled. Social Security offices are now taking applications from people who are not getting public assistance, but think they may be eligible for these new federal payments. People who are now getting state or local aid don't have to apply for supplemental security income payments. They will be contacted before the program starts in January. This new program establishes for the first time a national floor of cash income for people 65 or over, or blind, or disabled. The amount of their payments will depend on their income. For more information about supplemental security income payments, call, write, or visit any Social Security office.
This machine has a life-saving purpose. Breath for a newborn baby struggling to live. One of the March of Dimes' many efforts to fight birth defects. But birth defects are forever unless you help. Give to the March of Dimes.
Don't miss football's grand climax, the Super Bowl. Miami versus Minnesota, Sunday at 3, 2 Central, noon Pacific time on CBS.
Tonight we have, for a welcome change, some brighter news in the energy crisis, and the Los Angeles School Board says youngsters will have to go on getting to school in the dark. Bill Applegate took a ride in a blimp looking for whales. David Sheehan has people who were hit hard by a powerful movie. I'm Bill Stout, and I'll be right back with all the news from the KNXT newsroom.